Welcome back to the channel, everyone. This is Dylan Golby. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about a compositional technique or a method that I apply pretty much every time that I press the shutter button. So I've got quite a few of these composition-related videos in mind that I'm hoping to make as a little bit of a series going forward. So if that's something that you're interested in, please do let me know by giving this video a thumbs up and letting me know in the comments what sort of techniques you might like me to explore. I'm hoping I can put together a little series that'll be really helpful. So let's get started with today's topic. I recently added this photograph of a fisherman on the Han River here in Seoul to my Facebook profile, and I titled it Rare Solitude. And a good friend of mine actually got back to me and he said, yeah, rare solitude until he turns around and sees you with your camera or sees you getting your drone out of your bag to get more photographs. And I replied with, well, or until I extend my crop a few millimeters to each side and you see the other 50 people hanging around with him. And so this got me thinking a little bit about how it is that I approach composition and what it is that we can do to make our photographs sort of say the things that we want them to say. There's this phrase that gets thrown around that is, the camera never lies. And while that might be true of the machine itself, it's definitely not true of the operator behind the camera. We as photographers do tend to control the message a little bit. We photograph the things that we want to photograph. We crop out the things that we don't want, which is what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. We choose the light with which we photograph. We expose things differently than, say, the human eye might see them. And so it's with those things that we're able to, I guess, make photographs instead of just simple representations of, the scene in front of us. Photographic composition is a little bit different from composition in some other art forms. So if you consider, a writer or a painter or a musician, when they sit down to write, they basically start with, a blank sheet of paper, a blank canvas, or, fingers that need to go onto the fretboard of a guitar in order to make sounds. But when it comes to us as photographers, we're often faced with the chaos that is the world and basically having to tear that back until we get to what we want, rather than adding to nothing to make what we want. That concept is sort of what I'm going to look at today. How is it that we can take something that's extremely chaotic, extremely messy, and turn it into something that conveys what we want it to convey? That is the first thing that we need to do when we start considering making a composition. What is it that I want to say? What is it that made me take the camera out of my bag, put it to my eye, and want to make a photograph of this scene? How is it that I can give that message or that feeling to the viewers of my photograph? Once you've figured that out, then you're able to start composing the scene. So as photographers, I guess we're a little bit more like sculptors. We start with one thing and we basically have to chip away at it until we get to exactly what we want. And so when I do this, I typically like to ask myself a few questions. And the first one of these is obviously, what made me stop and want to photograph this scene? And then I ask myself, what do I not like about this scene? What is not part of the message that I want to show? And then another couple of questions that I might ask myself are, am I in the right place to make this composition? Do I have the right focal length to make this composition? And once I've started to think about all of these things, I'll then start to work on composing the scene itself. So let's look at a couple of examples about how I do that. One of the first tools that we have in our bag as photographers to be able to simplify a scene and take away the things that we don't want to be in there is actually the use of our aperture to work with a shallow depth of field. Let's start with this very simple photograph of a leaf that I made this autumn. What initially drew me to this was the light hitting the leaf. We get this beautiful warm light in autumn here in Korea, and on a clear day it makes everything in the world just seem a little bit nicer. And that's the feeling that I wanted to capture, that's the feeling that I wanted to convey here. So by using a shallow depth of field, I'm almost able to force the viewer's eye to right where I want them to look before they begin to explore the image further. So if I'd made this image at something like f11 versus f1.4, you might begin looking at the image somewhere else. You might be looking at some of the leaves in the background or the grass in the foreground rather than exactly what I want you to look at. So here f1.4 really allows me to say, look at this, and then begin to explore. This technique can be really useful in something like a portrait session or product photography, where you might want the viewer to initially look at that very first thing, that thing that you want them to look at, but then explore the background as it might add a few extra things to the composition. Now, I use this quite a bit in my family sessions where I might have, one child out in front of the family whose expression I want to be really front and center, and I'll photograph them at f2 or f4 but we can still see the family behind, and we can still get a sense of their expressions in that sort of out of focus area, but your eyes are drawn immediately to that high contrast, sharp area in focus where maybe that first child is just laughing or having a great time. Another easy way to remove distractions from your images is to choose a camera position or a focal length that allows you to basically crop them out. And that will allow you to show only what you want to show while removing things that don't need to be there. In this image, I'm showing far too much. There are way too many things for the viewer to look at. You might be drawn to the tool rack in the background, which is a little bit brighter. You might be drawn to the man's expression, which is generally where humans will look first in a photograph. Or you might be drawn to the wood shavings in his hands. But honestly, I want you to look at the wood shavings. So in this case, a far more powerful way to do that is to get closer and show just that. Another good example of this in practice would be this photo of Mount Fuji in Japan. This scene is from Kawaguchiko, and it's quite cluttered. We can see the town at the base of the mountain, the surrounding hills, the water. On the right there's actually a bridge if we pan over a little bit further, and occasionally people are walking in front of your camera position here, and so you'll get them in as well. In this case, I'm taking in way too much of the scene and, basically taking away from the majesty of the mountain that I'm trying to photograph. By using a longer focal length and composing so that only the mountain, and in this case the cloud that drew my attention, are present in the composition, I'm able to create a far more powerful and direct composition of the scene. One more way to achieve this is to actually crop in post-production. Now, while a lot of cameras these days will have multiple ratios in camera, you can shoot in 16:9, or with something like the GFX, you can shoot in 65:24. It allows you to basically visualize the scene in a different way, but once you get home and you have that raw file, you have a much larger screen to work with, and you can actually start to refine that composition a little bit better. Last winter I took a trip down to a small town called Danyang in order to photograph Dodam Sambong, and I made a video about that which I'll link to up there and down below if you'd like to see a more complete set and a bit of an approach to getting multiple photographs from one scene. And one of the things that I wanted to do while I was down there was to actually get some photos of the frozen river and explore sort of the patterns in the ice and things like that. And I came across a subject which was one of the big bridges in the town, and it was reflected in the ice. And no matter how hard I tried with the original ratio of the GFX, that 4:3 sensor, I just couldn't make something interesting. I couldn't remove enough distractions and still have the sense of the ice and the bridge there. So I switched into the panoramic crop, which is the 65:24 on the GFX, and I started composing like that. And then when I got the image home, I was able to sort of refine that in Capture One and get the exact crop that I wanted. So let's take a look at the original RAW file, which is the full GFX sensor at 4:3. Now, if you look at that, there's just way too many things, Obviously, I'm already working in 65:24 in camera, so I can't actually see all the little distractions and things like that. But if you look here, you can sort of get a sense. There's the mountain, there's the road, there's the sky. There's all these things that we really don't want in the composition. But then if we actually go and look at the final crop, you can see that it's a far simpler image that gives you that same message I was trying to convey, but without all of the additional superfluous things around the sides. Another technique that we can use is to allow light and shadow to inform the way that we compose. Now, light gives us a really powerful tool with our cameras because while our eyes are able to basically switch, thousands of times a second and allow us to see into deep shadows and see into bright highlights, our cameras don't have that ability. So we can use the light that we would normally see really easily with our eyes to basically hide and reveal certain things in our compositions. Now, I did a video on this when I was talking about minimal street photography recently, and I'll link to that one again below, but let's take a look at a scene from that. With images like this one, we can essentially allow the deep shadows around the subject to just turn to almost complete black and not have any detail in them, which basically takes your attention away from them and into the highlighted areas where you're almost, again, forced to look at a certain subject. A great way to do this is to look for patches of light that will allow you to cover up certain things and illuminate others. Now, I love to do this at sunrise and sunset when you have a low angle to the light, and things like, mountains, trees, cars, buildings, all those sorts of things can obscure part of the light while still illuminating other things. And if you can look for interesting subjects that fall into that light, you can start to make some really interesting, simple compositions that sort of focus you on what you want to show. Something like these water droplets on grass after a storm in Seoul are a really good example of that. Before this video gets too long, I want to wrap up with one more tip, and that is to cover up the distractions with other elements in your composition. So if you find something that you're really interested in, but there's just so much going on around it, one of the things you can do is sort of step back a little bit, maybe use a longer focal length, and find other elements in the scene to cover up those distractions. In this scene that I shot while I was exploring a Shinto shrine in Tokyo, I was attracted to the red sash on the statue there. And the splash of color surrounded by that sort of monochromatic stone and the wooden fence there really stood out to me. But as you can see, there are sort of modern bricks and steel structures in the background, and also that fence in the foreground isn't the most interesting. So by simply raising my camera angle and using the purple curtains to cover up the buildings behind, I was able to simplify the composition down and basically give you the same message again, but not dilute it with these other unrelated subjects around it. To wrap up, basically what I encourage you to do is to take stock of a scene, decide what you like about it before you actually start trying to compose an image. And from there you can decide, do you want to use shallow depth of field? Do you want to use light? How can you cover up those distractions? How can you crop them out? And from there you can start to sort of build an image. Now, of course, you don't always have enough time to be able to do this, and not every image benefits from it, but it is a good way to start looking at composition and something that I do use quite a bit. I've got a slideshow coming up after this that has a few more images in it and sort of shows you how I put this into practice. But if you have any questions about, different compositional techniques, or maybe, one of my images that you've seen and you're wondering about the decisions that I made, or maybe even one of your images and you're thinking, why doesn't this work, or how could I have improved this, please do let me know in the comments below. I'd like these sort of future videos to be as useful to you guys as possible. Again, thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, please do like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers!